This is the Dilemmas on Screen, a Jewish perspective podcast, where we take ambiguous moral situations in fictional popular movies and TV shows and analyze them from a Torah lens. As a quick overview, The Lord of the Rings is a story about a hobbit, or a halfling, named Frodo, who comes into possession of a powerful magic ring. One of its powers is that when a person puts it on, they become invisible. This ring turns out to be the One Ring, which was forged by the Dark Lord Sauron ages ago to take control of Middle-earth and everyone in it. In order to destroy Sauron and save Middle-earth, the ring must be destroyed. The thing is, this ring cannot be destroyed just anywhere or in any which way. It has to specifically be brought into Sauron's home territory, Mordor, and thrown into the fires where the ring was originally forged in Mount Doom. Needless to say, this is a daunting task, but Frodo steps up to the plate and volunteers to do so. He is then tasked with taking the ring, bringing it into Mordor, and throwing the ring into the volcanic fires therein. To help him, he is joined by a small fellowship of folks who all embark on the quest to destroy the ring. Down the road, the fellowship breaks up, and Frodo is split off from the group, joined only by his friend, Sam. Further down the road, Frodo and Sam are attacked by Gollum, a formerly hobbit-like creature. Gollum attacks them because, for centuries, he was in possession of the ring and he has become addicted to it and wants it back. He wants it back badly. The ring has a corrupting influence on any individual who beholds it, and certainly anyone who possesses it. The longer a person holds it for, the more powerful the ring's corrupting effect. That said, the ring does not corrupt everyone equally, and it is noted that hobbits in particular appear to resist many of its corrupting effects. Frodo is able to tame Gollum, and Gollum now serves as their guide to Mordor. Off they go, and long story short, Frodo eventually reaches Mount Doom. He stands exactly where he needs to, takes out the ring, holds it above the fire. The moment of truth is here. If Frodo casts the ring into the fire, Sauron will be destroyed, his powers will vanish, and victory can be declared by the good guys. But Frodo hesitates. The ring has worked its corruptive magic on Frodo, and in the end, Frodo does not throw the ring into the fire while Sam watches. In the movies, Frodo says, "The ring is mine." Frodo then puts the ring on his finger and turns invisible. Nonetheless, Gollum quickly jumps on Frodo, bites Frodo's ring finger off, and claims the ring. In the movie, Frodo ends up fighting with Gollum for the ring, and Gollum ends up falling off the cliff into the fire, and the ring is destroyed. In the books, Gollum is simply lost in glee and falls off the cliff on his own. Regardless of the movie or book version, the question of Frodo's moral failure is more or less unaffected. This leads us into the following questions. 1. Was Frodo's failure to destroy the ring a moral failure? At the end of the day, he did not cast the ring into the fire, and by his own admission, he chose not to do so. In Tolkien's quotes, that we'll see later in this episode, we'll see that Tolkien stated that it was impossible for Frodo to resist. But how do we understand Frodo? In the books, as we'll see in this episode, Frodo said he chose not to destroy the ring. Now Tolkien is saying, actually, he had no free will. Do we agree? As in, can a person be mistaken about whether he's making a free will decision? So how do we deal with this? We feel like we're choosing, but we're not? What's the Jewish perspective on this? We think it is pertinent to note that Tolkien himself addressed this topic, seeing as he apparently received a number of inquiries about Frodo's failure. Before we do, though, an important caveat for the listener. I am obviously quoting specific selections of Tolkien's writings and letters. It is not my intent to offend by being selective about my quotes or try to cast Tolkien's views in a different way than Tolkien intended. I am simply using them to summarize the fairly long contents of the letters as I understand them. Last point. We repeatedly discuss in this episode the question of Frodo's failure. We do not mean whether he, Frodo, succeeded in destroying the ring or failed to do so. We are asking if he failed morally. Please keep that clear, so that when you hear different iterations of, did Frodo fail, what we're really asking is, was Frodo's failure to destroy the ring a moral failure? In other words, did Frodo fail morally? Let's see how the Torah approaches this dilemma. I am excited to welcome Rabbi Yoni Ganger to this episode to answer our questions. Rabbi Ganger has lived in Boston with his family for the last 10 years, working on the Harvard campus as the program director of Maor, a Jewish outreach organization. He also runs a Jewish young professional program. In addition to Jewish education, Rabbi Ganger works as a therapist at the Center for Anxiety, a private practice therapy group with several offices in the Northeast that specializes in treating a wide variety of mental health issues using evidence-based treatments. Rabbi Ganger aims to weave psychology with Jewish wisdom both on campus and in his practice in order to best serve both his students and his clients. Please reach out to yganger@maor.org for any questions about Judaism, psychology, or Lord of the Rings. All right. Rabbi Ganger, thank you so much for joining us. And I guess we'll just launch into it. So, to see, Frodo undertook the quest to destroy the ring. He gets to Mount Doom, and then he decides to take it for himself. That's ultimately claimed. And the ring does get destroyed, but not through any active choice of Frodo. And so our question is, did Frodo fail? At the end of the day, he did not cast the ring into the fire, which was his task. And according to him, he chose not to do so. Even though, yes, the ring did get destroyed, but did Frodo fail? That's our question.
Fabulous question, and a question that's been discussed from time immemorial. Who is the true hero of our story? Is it Samwise? Is it Frodo? Is it Gollum? Lots of debate to be had about it. Well, it really depends how you define free will. As we know, there's a famous quote, Pirkei Avot. This has become kind of a colloquial quote that many people know. I don't realize it's actually a quote from Pirkei Avot, which is, you cannot judge a person until you get into his shoes, so to speak, but into his place, where you understand all of his factors, all of his background, what he's struggling with, his internal world. We really cannot know ever whether a person is a failure. In fact, it's really fascinating. Jumping back for a second, free will is kind of a core value within Jewish thought. Basically, the whole system of Jewish thought is predicated on the idea that we have free will, which, by the way, is not so straightforward nowadays. Actually, the prevailing view among many academics, Robert Sapolsky and others, is that free will, it really is an illusion. It does not exist. And this is actually kind of intuitive if you think about it. If you take a physicalist perspective where you do not believe in the fact that there is a soul or something higher or spirituality, reality is we're just stuck with a lump of tissue called the brain. That brain functions according to physical laws. There's nothing magical about that. And therefore, technically speaking, even Robert Sapolsky says, if you knew all the starting factors and all the environment, you would be able to perfectly predict a human being. He says people come to his office and says, yeah, but did you know I was going to lift my hand? He said, yeah, technically speaking, I'm sure I could figure that out. If I really knew all of your factors and backgrounds and inputs and outputs, we could really do it. So just to begin, free will itself is under attack. However, from a Jewish perspective, free will is at the heart of the entire system because it's the only thing that allows human beings to get the so-called credit that they deserve for their decision-making. And if we go back one more step, sorry to take it all the way back, sometimes happens in Judaism to understand something, you have to understand everything, that the initial reason for why we are here in the first place is so that we can use our free will to make difficult choices, thereby our choices become a product of our essential self and our own responsibility, and therefore we get credit, so to speak, for making the right choice. And really, that's what we're here to do, is to get credit for our choices.
What types of choices? Are we talking like vanilla or chocolate ice cream, or?
That's right. So everyone talks about that. There are many different types of choices, and most commentaries understand, and actually there's a quote from the Talmud, one of the Talmudic tractates, Talmud, of course, being the oral Torah, the repository of our collective wisdom that is rooted in the Torah, but not explicitly stated in the Torah. So the Talmud in Brachot says that Hakol b'yedei Shemayim chutz mi'yirei Shemayim, everything is in the hands of heaven except for awe of heaven, aka taking responsibility. So most things are, in fact, not really free will choices. They are, as Robert Sapolsky says, most of our choices are indeed a product of our environment, our genes, our backgrounds, our experiences. There's just a small segment of choice that has to be in the realm of a moral choice. It's doing something that is correct, even though it is difficult and goes against our natural inclinations, but we do it anyway because we think it's morally right to do it. That's the definition of a free will choice. Anything that falls outside of that is actually not a free will choice. It has to have a moral component to be a free will choice in the first place.
Got it. So like whether or not I choose vanilla or chocolate ice cream wouldn't make a difference. But let's say if there's 1 scoop of vanilla left and 10 scoops of chocolate, I know the guy after me wants to get the vanilla, then I'm like,
Right. And therefore, in that case, if you wanted the vanilla more and you purposely chose against it to get the chocolate so you could do good, make a giving act for your friend or the person behind you, that would be a moral act, and therefore the ice cream now has entered the moral realm. What's fascinating about the example you gave is that really in some level, so like this. All right, so chocolate vanilla is not really a free will choice. It's really what you're doing is you're trying to assess, you're trying to really just get in touch with yourself. Which desire, whatever it is, memory is sparking stronger right now, and you're just kind of trying to become aware of what is stronger. So again, it's not a free will choice. You're just, what's the real pull? However, we can always, almost always, if we want, make any choice have an element that has a moral component to it. Could be, I want to restrain how much I eat for self-growth. How I eat. I want to make this eating of ice cream a grateful eating of ice cream. I remember one of my rabbis used to say that he used to watch one of his mentors. His name was Rabbi Volpe. He was one of the leaders of the previous generation and really refined in his character. He said he would be moved watching his rabbi eat ice cream. Just the way he ate it was itself a whole class on how to appreciate the world, how to derive enjoyment and gratitude for the world. So again, most of us are not at that level to make ice cream a spiritual experience, but in theory, yes, we can really turn any sort of experience into a free will experience if we choose to. That being said, on the opposite is true, which is most people in the world today, they never make a free will choice in their life if they are just going with how they feel and just going through the motions of, okay, I feel like doing this today, I feel like doing that today. They never really struggle with anything. They may not be making any free will choices whatsoever.
I would assume if you were to ask them, you'd be like, yeah, of course I'm making free will choices. How would a person know whether or not they are making a free will choice?
Great question. So I think the way it was explained is that it has to be that there is an element of struggle and an element of going against your nature. So let me give you a really great example. So I mentioned the Rabbi Dessler. So Rabbi Dessler Rabbi Dessler lived about 50 years ago. He lived in England and Israel, and he was kind of a leading philosophical thinker about really deep topics in Judaism. He had a great skill in combining elements of mysticism and character development along with philosophical aspects into one whole picture. And he has a fascinating discussion on free will. Something he talks about is that a person only gets credit for that which he struggles against. So he gives a great example from the Torah. So we know that there was a famous episode of what's called Sodom and Gomorrah. Most people know about it. That's where these two cities, which were quite wicked, were destroyed because of the fact that they outlawed any kindness to any visitors. So what's interesting to note is that one person does get saved from that city. And who is that? It's Lot. Lot was Abraham's nephew. Now, growing up in Abraham's house, there was an ethos of going above and beyond for any single guest, no matter what. And this is how Lot grew up. This was his role model and example. He went so far, Lot, despite of his character flaws, still had this character trait inside of himself, to the point that when he was living in Sodom and Gomorrah, even though it was outlawed to do any kindness for any guest, Lot was willing to risk his life to do kindness for a guest.
I'm assuming when you say it's outlawed to do kindness to a guest in Sodom and Gomorrah, that by pain of death. Is that right?
Correct. Then again, they had a reason for it. It wasn't that they were just totally malicious and evil. They just felt that doing kindness for people actually stunts them. If you're doing for somebody else and they can never get out of their 2 feet, that was their philosophy. Of course, they took it way too far, and it was wrong. They weren't coming from a place of just evil malevolence. It was an ideology. In any case. So what's fascinating is Lot, again, has this incredible moment of divine justice where God intervenes personally for Lot. He sends 2 angels in to save Lot from this catastrophe. Now, you might think, why would he do that? Well, Lot just risked his life for kindness for a stranger. The Torah says, no, that's not why he was saved. He was, because you know why? Because he gets almost no credit even for risking his life to do kindness, because that's just something that was natural to him. It was something he learned from Abraham. It was easy for him to do that. Why was he saved? Ultimately, he was saved because many, many years ago, there was an episode where Abraham and Sarah and Lot end up in Egypt. Now, back then, it was normal, let's call it, that a husband could be killed if the locals desired his wife and thought that she was beautiful. They would just dispose of the husband. Now, Sarah was going down to Egypt. She was exotic, so to speak. She looked different. She was beautiful, the Torah says, independently of that. So Avram knew that the Egyptians would take off his head pretty quickly. So he devised a plan. He said, you know what, I'm going to say that she's my sister. And back then, what was true was that if there was an older brother, that he would be in charge of marrying off his sister, and they wouldn't kill him. They would just negotiate with him. So this was a safer play for Abraham. And therefore, that's what he did. And Lot, of course, knew that this wasn't true. I mean, it was true in a way because technically Sarah was Abraham's niece. And these could be called sister. So it wasn't completely a lie. Torah goes out of his way to show that Avram wasn't fully lying. But nonetheless, it was definitely a stretch. And in any case, the Torah says that Lot never gave up the secrets. And Lot was of the character type to maybe make money off of this deal, somehow frame his uncle so he could become a hero. Who knows what?
Right, especially since he actually ended up moving to Sodom and Gomorrah. He clearly had an interest in material wealth.
100%, right? That's what Sodom and Gomorrah was all about. So yes, he was definitely involved in material wealth, and he could have used that episode in some way for his own benefit, and he didn't. That was against his character, and that's what the Torah says. That's why he was saved from Sodom and Gomorrah. Not for risking his life down the road. Why? Because it was struggle involved. It was going against his character. So that's how we understand free will. How do you know if you're making a free will decision? Are you going against the grain? Are you swimming upstream? As one rabbi used to say, you have the taste of salmon in your mouth, right? Salmon are the fish that swim upstream. If you have that taste of salmon in your mouth where you're going upstream against kind of just the way things flow, that's a good indication that there's a good chance you're using your free will at that moment.
Wow, cool. That's great. So I guess, bringing it back to Frodo. So did Frodo fail? Because in the end, to quote the books, I mean, it's fairly similar in the movies. There's no substantive difference. So Frodo says, I have come, he said, but I do not choose now to do what I came to do. I will not do this deed. The ring is mine. And then it's 2 pages later, right, there's Gollum effectively gets the ring off of Frodo. Gollum, in glee, falls off the cliff into the lava, and the ring gets destroyed. In the movie, Gollum and Frodo fight it out, and then Gollum still falls off and destroys the ring. But then afterwards, Frodo says, but for him, Sam, I could not have destroyed the ring. So now the question is, did he fail?
I think there's a few indications from the movie that maybe he did fail. So number one, as we know, so I was mentioning Rav Dessler earlier, one thing he says in his essay on free will is that, again, it's like two armies that are battling each other, and there's a point where they meet. And therefore, that battle line is where our free will lies. So, for example, most people don't need to make a free will decision every single day not to steal. It's just not something that they grew up with. It's not something they think about at all whatsoever. So for them, making the free will choice, I'm not going to steal today, again, 0 credit. We only bump into free will where it's at the edge of your capacity of knowing what's right and wrong for yourself. So, for example, for most people, free will would be more along the lines of, I'm going to give charity today. Am I going to stretch myself to give a little more charity today than usual? That could be your free will point. But it goes in both directions. So Rav Dessler says that it could be if you grew up in a band of thieves and it's normal for you to steal. Guess what? When you steal, technically speaking, you're not truly responsible. It could be your free will choice for you is when I steal, I'm not going to hurt anybody in the process. That's the part for me that's a struggle. Is stealing that important to me? I'm willing to hurt somebody else. So that could be your free will struggle. And therefore, a thief could be a righteous person if he decides that day, I'm not going to hurt someone this time. He's moved up a level. He's pushed the envelope. And therefore, in that case, that would be an indication that in God's eyes, on some level, he's somewhat of a good person. He takes it to an incredible degree how relative this is, depending on how you grew up. So we could definitely look at Frodo that way and say, hey, he's under the influence of the ring. We know that the greats of Middle Earth entrust themselves with the ring. So all the more so, a little person like Frodo, right? We know Galadriel, she thought about the ring and taking it. She was worried she'd become a witch. Gandalf as well did not want to risk it. So we know this was a tremendous challenge. So maybe for Frodo, the victory was not destroying the ring. The fact that he even went near Mount Doom, every single step he took on the journey may have been a struggle, that he's going towards the destruction. And that could have made him a complete success. And there was at a certain point, if you lose your entire ability to see right and wrong, like at the end, if the ring completely overtakes him, could be he doesn't lose credit for it. So that's definitely one angle we could take on this, but I think there are other angles we could take as well.
Oh, interesting. And also just go back to that point you were making earlier about the thieves and not being a free will decision to steal, because that's just kind of, this is my livelihood. This is how I go about things. There's also a nice contrast just because Lot didn't get any credit for doing an act of kindness. That's kind of, I think most people would be like, hey, that's not fair.
Not only kindness at the expense of his life.
Yeah, good point. Right. Then the kindness at the expense of his life. And even so, minimal credit there because that was just his nature. So people, I think, might rebel against that. Like, that's not fair. On the other hand, it's like, okay, but you also don't get demerits, if you will, if you have a natural tendency towards stealing. It's not something you even question. It's almost like a fair system. You're not going to get any credits for the things that come naturally.
You are only responsible for that which you could have been responsible for. And if your education did not allow you to be responsible for certain things, then it could be that you're not responsible. Now, we have to be a little bit careful here. I want to add some caveats here. So there's an interesting point that there is, for example, let's say you're at a criminal court and you claim that there were delusional voices telling you to do something. So let's say Frodo inside of his head, which we don't know what was going on inside his head, but let's say there were two voices. There was a voice of Gandalf in his head saying, hey, you are on a mission to destroy the ring and save Middle-earth. And then there was a really loud voice, the voice of Sauron, or whatever the voice would be, taking hold of him, possession of him, and saying, you cannot destroy this ring. It is the key to power and greatness. You will never want to destroy it. It is against your own, whatever it is, whatever the temptations are, you cannot do it. Let's say he had that struggle. So as long as Frodo had some awareness that there was a right thing to do here, which is destroy the ring, even if you have a compulsive voice telling you to do something wrong, that even though it's almost stretching beyond your free will point, that being said, in a criminal sort of element, you're still guilty because you're not so detached from reality. You're not aware of what's right and wrong. If, however, the ring's power is so intense that the voice of Gandalf is completely drowned out, there is no other voice. There is just the voice of Sauron. And he can't even hear anything else, and he's possessed, then I think we have to say Frodo is absolved. What could he do? He is completely detached from any sort of reality whatsoever. So I think that's one caveat we can add here, which we don't know exactly what was going on in his head. Is there some struggle? No struggle. Now, I want to say the reason why I think it's more complicated with Frodo is we see from the books and the movie that different characters actually had different pulls towards the ring. Case in point is, of course, Boromir. Boromir was much more drawn to the ring than Aragorn, for example. Boromir was constantly kind of looking after it, trying to get it, potentially. And at one point, he fell and actually tried to steal it from Frodo. Aragorn never did that. So it is clear that there is something about the character of the person, or the being in this case, right? We don't have the Legolas, the elf, never went after it. Gimli, the dwarf, they all had that moment in Rivendell where they were all looking at the ring with a bit of temptation. But again, no one more than Boromir. So we do see that there seems to be levels of temptation. Now, if we want to get really into Lord of the Rings lore about this, there's a character that doesn't appear in the movies, but appears only in the books, and his name is Tom Bombadil. Gandalf says that had he had the ring, he would not have cared about it, and it wouldn't have affected him at all. And he would probably have just misplaced it, because it would have done nothing to him. So it's very interesting. Why is that? Why would it, for certain characters like Boromir, it's a tremendous temptation. For other characters, it's zero temptation. So it does beg the question of whether or not there has to be some seed of ego or something the ring has to use to play against yourself. And if you really have no ego or are perfect in some way, that it can have no effect. The reason why this is important is because there's actually a Talmudic source which is fascinating. There's a Talmudic source in Bava Batra that says as follows. Rav Amram says that Rav says that the three sins for which a person is not spiritual, meaning the three things that a person cannot help, which seems to, again, contradict. Why is it called a sin if you can't help it? We just said that you're only responsible for things that you can control. But he says the following. He says they are having sinful thoughts and committing sins concerning deliberation and prayer and uttering malicious speech. The Gemara says, right? The Gemara asks, can enter your mind that a person cannot go through a day without saying something nasty? He says, no, rather even a hint of, sometimes when it comes to the laws of evil speech, it's very sensitive. If you even say something that's a hint that someone could take the wrong way, that's already a problem. But the point is that one of the commentaries asks, 1 second, as we all know, we all have crazy thoughts at some points throughout the day, thoughts that don't reflect who we are. They just kind of enter our mind. And the Talmud seems to indicate we're responsible for that. How is that possible? So he says the following that.
Sorry, just to clarify the question that's asked is, how can you be liable even for like a stray thought that goes through your mind? I'm assuming a negative thought, like, oh, that guy is such a jerk. Or
why is the Talmud calling it a sin if it's a stray thought? The Talmud indicates we cannot avoid it. It's impossible. Now, we said before that if something is impossible, for example, you don't even see it as wrong, how could it be that we are responsible for it? That's where we ask the question about why is it called a sin? It shouldn't be called a sin. It's just something that pops into your head. So one of the commentators said, yes, there is an aspect where a person can get up to a level where you pretend like you're almost like an angel, and you can actually in some way even get above these three what we call sins. So we have to recognize our own personal greatness of how far we can go and strive for. And therefore, the fact that you didn't reach a certain level, so again, we have the free will battle. The fact that you didn't get to a certain destination in your battle, that's what you're responsible for. So it seems to be indicated on this level that there is some level of guilt here for Frodo if he didn't get to that level of what we'll call the Tom Bombadil level where things don't affect you, you're totally egoless. So that could be a possible way of looking at it as well.
It's almost like kind of like normal people levels in terms of you're responsible for your actions. And then the idea behind this Gemara, this Talmudic quote, is that there are some things that are just unavoidable and people don't bear responsibility for. But actually, according to the commentators, you can bear responsibility if you reach such a high level, like you've become such a refined individual that at that point you actually, what normal people would not be responsible for, you actually are responsible for because this person has reached such a high level. That's the example of Tom Bombadil in terms of Tom Bombadil had no desire whatsoever for the ring. That's achievable maybe by like a tiny handful of people.
Well, the Talmud seems to think it's really achievable by everybody. There's a theoretical level that we can strive for, which is called becoming angelic. And therefore, if you haven't become angelic on that level, you're kind of stuck in your free will battles. You're in the middle of a war, but you haven't won the war to the extent that human beings can win. There's some level of responsibility there. You could have blitzkrieged in a certain way and gone to the top. That is that ability. And again, this is according to the school of thought by, there's some great ones. For example, the Alt of Sparta, more recent rabbi who says that the whole struggle of a human being is really just to understand how great they are. They just understood their greatness, the inner angelic force that resides inside of them and just tapped into it fully. Many of these struggles wouldn't be struggles. And so that's, I think, that element here. So again, there's that question over here for Frodo is, was there some tiny possibility that he could get to that super high level or not? Or was it really a complete takeover internally?
I actually want to follow up on that point because that is a good point. And Tolkien addresses this. Again, it's kind of hard to tell as a reader. And I'll be quoting a few points by Tolkien just because this is apparently a very common question that he would get. Did Frodo fail? Is Frodo failure to a degree? If so, why? If not, why not? So here's what he says, quoting Tolkien. So I do not think that Frodo's was a moral failure. At the last moment, the pressure of the ring would reach its maximum. Impossible, I should have said, for anyone to resist. Certainly after long possession, months of increasing torment, and when starved and exhausted. Frodo had done what he could and spent himself completely, as an instrument of providence, and had produced a situation in which the object of his quest could be achieved. This is in one of his letters. And then he concludes with, moral failure can only be asserted, I think, when a man's effort or endurance falls short of his limits, and the blame decreases as that limit is closer approached. I thought that was a very interesting perspective. Yes, in terms of Frodo could have achieved this monumental Tom Bombadil level of achievement, but according to Tolkien, he's like, look, it's kind of like what you said. Could Frodo hear only Gandalf or only Sauron or a bit of both? Was Gandalf a whisper? It sounds like, according to Tolkien at least, that Frodo was just completely wiped out. It was just impossible for him to resist. I was checking some online forums to see, like, what do people think? And, I'm a fairly big fan of Lord of the Rings, but some people are like, they really know Lord of the Rings, Silmarillion, all the other books, and like what Tolkien had to say about them. And one person had a really interesting theory. It was, in fact, impossible for Frodo to throw it in. The evidence they cite is, why didn't Sauron just leave a couple of orcs at the entrance so that if anyone came up, like Frodo, the orcs would have just killed Frodo and like taken the ring and given it to Sauron? That would have been an easy, like a failsafe. But the reason why Sauron didn't do that is because it was inconceivable to him that someone would actually throw the ring into Mount Doom on purpose. It's just never going to happen. No one will throw the ring in. I was like, wow, I never really thought about that. Because truth is, I did think, I was like, this was such an easy catch, Sauron. Like, you failed, Sauron. Why didn't you just protect it in some way? It sounds like Sauron was just not concerned about it.
Hard to, though, the one, if we want to go Talmudic about this in Lord of the Rings, I will say, though, that if we recall from the movies, at least, I don't know if it's in the book, but the whole play at the end was a distraction play. And that it could be that they tried to remove the orcs who may have been guarding Mount Doom and get them to the gate. That was the whole reason for their attack. If you remember, Aragorn says, let's give Frodo a chance. But yeah, it's only Tolkien understands quite similar to Dessler in a way that, yeah, we are only responsible for it if we at the edge of our limits. And I think that it is an important point that you mentioned, right? Psychologically, at least we know that our choices do diminish as we get tired. And this is actually one of the reasons why it says, for example, that teachers of Torah should never fast because they want to have patience for their kids, for their students. So we know, right? We do know that we do change as we hunger and tire. And our character changes, and that, again, Talmud indicates that it'd be very hard to control our moods, our tempers in that state. So no question that just definitely adds some more, won't call it an excuse, but more reason to believe that, yes, Frodo was well beyond his level of limits. It could not be expected that he could reach that angelic level. We don't know 100%, but yeah, it definitely leans much more towards he did the best he could, and every step was probably a difficult step for him along the way, and this was just one step too far, as they say.
Interesting, and actually picking up on that theme, that I've heard that sometimes a decision that it's not even in the moral realm because it's just too easy becomes in the moral realm the more difficult it becomes. And by that, it's like Rav Bernstein in Jerusalem. He asked, he's like, would you steal an apple from the store? I think most people would say no. It's like, okay, well, what if you're hungry? Still no. It's like, okay, well, what if you're very hungry? You start amping up the pressure on you're really hungry. Maybe you don't like the store owner. Maybe you start kind of messing with a bit of the situations, a situation that was once formerly very clear. Me, I would never steal an apple from the store. But now suddenly you start kind of amping up the pressure. The moral balance really starts to tilt. But it sounds like it can tip over. One question I had that I thought was really interesting was the interplay between Frodo's perspective as Frodo sees it and the way Tolkien, the creator of Frodo, saw it. Frodo says, I failed. He effectively concedes it. And he's like, but for him, Sam, I cannot have destroyed the ring. It plagued him. He's like, I chose not to destroy it. In fact, he says that. He says, I have come, he said, but I do not choose now to do what I came to do. I will not do the deed. The ring is mine. Choice. Tolkien says, actually, no choice. Frodo did not have a choice. That to me is apparently Frodo thought that he was making a choice. According to Tolkien, he was not. Can a person think that he's making a free will choice and actually he's not making a free will choice?
So we could dive into a little bit what we call a supernatural level. What I mean by that is the only thing I would say is similar, almost in kind, to what Frodo had to deal with is actually the test of what we call the Akedah. The Akedah Yitzchak by Abraham, the binding of Isaac, which was what the Torah describes as the impossible test. Abraham was the original forefather, the person that gets Judaism, what would eventually be Judaism off the ground. And his whole character arc is fascinating in the Torah. And that is that the main character arc of Abraham is his essence was a person who was all about love. Love and giving was what defined him, and faith in the divine. On a deeper level, we understand that to develop as a human being, what we want to do is we want to develop our strengths in life. And once we're strong and successful in that which we're naturally inclined to do, then we kind of start testing our free will more in the other direction, try to do things that are hard for us, that are go against the grain. And so therefore, God wanted Avram to be the perfect beginning to the Jewish people. And therefore he says, okay, Avram, you're really good at loving kindness. I'm going to give you 10 tests that all have to do with your weakness, which is setting limits, being tough, so to speak. And there's no greater test than being tough and setting limits than murder. And so he tests Avram and says, you know what? I want you to kill that one son you've been waiting for 100 years for. I want you to kill that one son. Now, the problem was not only was this test so difficult because it went against Avram's nature, but it went against logic on many levels. First of all, killing's wrong. Why would God ask Avram to do something immoral? More than that, Avram's whole life was dedicated to going and being against child sacrifice. And now God's asking him to throw away all of your life's work and do a child sacrifice. Not only that, God told him Isaac's going to be your future seed, your future generations. And Avram has to put his head down and say, this makes no sense whatsoever on any level. But if the divine of the world, who knows everything, now I'm just a small human being, I'm going to put my head down and just do it. So this is a term what's called the impossible test. And this is why the greatest merit of the entire Jewish people is how the Jewish people begin at that level of impossibility. And that is kind of a way of sharing with all future generations that Jewish people have the capacity to do the impossible, to go above and beyond all free will, what would be normal free will decisions, and just plug into this incredible level of emunah, we call it, that allows us to do the impossible. And so I think there could be, again, if we want to look at it, and maybe Frodo has a feeling of this on some level, that he does know deep in his heart of hearts, it's always possible for the human being to do the impossible. And therefore he could have jumped into some, again, that super level and done it and followed through. Obviously, I think Tolkien He's the creator, Frodo, he's the father figure. So the father's always more compassionate. He says, it was too hard. But I think from the driver's seat, we always know that there's some higher level we can always tap into. As hard as it may be, it's there, it's latent. And Abraham jumped into it, and there is always that potential to jump into it if we can really try. That's one thing. Obviously, we want to be psychological about it. Our tendency is always to self-blame, have negative self-talk. Frodo's no different. We always want to think that we're bigger than we really are and be illusionary. I could have done it. Could you? Hard to say.
So what you're saying is, from a Jewish perspective, we would disagree with Tolkien. Like, yes, it was close to impossible in terms of it was exceptionally difficult and there's no downplaying it. However, Frodo still, he could have. Very hard, very hard. Yeah.
We can jump into the impossible. That's where the Jewish people begin where the impossible starts. And the whole point of that is to challenge our free will. What we think is impossible often is our own self-limitations. We think something's impossible. We think we can't. And it's really we don't want to. And if we really are expansive about it, we can really do things that are unbelievable.
You know, that's really interesting because I saw another quote by Tolkien. It's a bit of a longer one. I'm more interested in the second part than the first, but I don't want to quote it out of context. So here's what he says. I think it can be observed in history and experience that some individuals seem to be placed in sacrificial positions, situations or tasks that for perfection of solution demand powers beyond their utmost limits, even beyond all possible limits for an incarnate creature in a physical world, in which a body may be destroyed or so maimed that it affects the mind and will. Here's the critical point. Judgment upon any such case should then depend on the motives and disposition with which he started out and should weigh his actions against the utmost possibility of his powers all along the road to whatever proved the breaking point. So I think there are 2 points that Tolkien is saying. First, that what are the motives and dispositions where he started? I'm kind of curious about that. I definitely have some thoughts about it, but what I'm more interested in is, and you should weigh his actions against the utmost possibility of his powers. Now, the way Tolkien seems to understand this is that's exactly what Frodo did. Frodo did it to the utmost possibility of his powers. According to Judaism, we're like, there is some extra he could have done. What are your thoughts?
I think the key point that you mentioned is the peak of his powers. As we know that the Jewish people put on, at least Jewish males, put on tefillin every morning. And one interesting thing about the mitzvah of tefillin, those are the black boxes with the straps. What we put on is that we specifically put the straps, one of the tefillin, on the weaker arm. And the idea that we're trying to share is that when you have a true connection and faithfulness, then you can transcend your limits. Even your weak arm can become powerful when you're connected to something higher. And that's the idea over here is that you're right. According to his power, correct, there's a limit to Frodo's power. However, in Judaism, there's turbocharging where you transcend your limits by not tapping into your power, but truly connecting with God's power.
Wow, that's awesome. So what you're saying is when you're just thinking about kind of we as mortal beings have limits, but as long as you're able to kind of tap into the divine will, again, like as represented by the tefillin, right? That the phylacteries that go into your arm and your head, it's put on your weaker arm to show it's not your power ultimately, it's God's power. And as long as you are doing what you're supposed to be doing, then you'll be given the power to do it. I'm assuming this means in the moral realm, right? I mean, you could want to throw hoops like Michael Jordan or LeBron James, but...
Yeah, we always have some physical limitations. But yeah, in the spiritual world, we really have no limitations because we're creating a divine image. And therefore, we do have this infinite well inside of us that we can, if we can learn to allow ourselves access to it, it can supercharge us in ways we can't imagine.
That's awesome. I love that. One final question, going back to the stating that we ultimately can do anything, is just because Tolkien seems to almost address this head on. Tolkien notes that, and again, this is a direct quote, Frodo indeed failed as a hero, as conceived by simple minds. He did not endure to the end, he gave in, ratted. I do not say simple minds with contempt. They often see with clarity the simple truth and the absolute ideal to which effort must be directed, even if it is unattainable. So, I mean, now, I almost feel like Tolkien's looking at us and be like, it's unattainable. Yeah, how do you respond to that? Or is it, going back to the tefillin example, he would say, like, it was impossible. It was impossible. It was not attainable. And the fact that you think, yes, he failed because he could have attained it, that's a simple mind.
Again, I think we go back to that framework of what we call the miraculous. Another example of this is when the Jewish people are trying to split the sea, or they're stuck by the sea and the Egyptian army is bearing down on them. We know the sea doesn't split until that final moment. It took the Jewish people to go up to their noses in the water. Then and only then did it split. And so there's, again, that level of impossibility of going all the way. And we can claim Frodo went all the way into the, he went to Mount Doom, he pushed himself, he got through tremendous tests along the way. And it was really phenomenal. And again, that question is, could he have gone this one last final gear that transcended his entire ego and everything about himself for the dedication of the mission? That, I think, is the difference, because at the end of the day, when it comes to Frodo, his mission was sent to him ultimately by Gandalf, by another human being or a wizard, but it wasn't sent to him, let's say, by, when I get into Lord of the Rings lore, by the ultimate god who was Eru, but the more proximate god was Manwë, represented by the eagles at the end over there. But there's ultimately the eagles that always come save the day. So that is kind of the divine intervention there. So again, he didn't have that extra gear because he wasn't manifesting the will of something beyond Middle Earth or beyond his realm. He was only manifesting the will of the human beings around him. You're right. For Frodo, there wasn't that extra gear that there may be had it been a higher test or a higher willed directive.
I think based on Tolkien, I think he, in his letter, he said, at the last moment, the pressure of the ring would reach its maximum, impossible, I should have said, for anyone to resist. Certainly after long possession, months of increasing torment, and when starved and exhausted, Frodo had done what he could and spent himself completely. And then Tolkien has the parenthetical, as an instrument of providence, capital P Providence. So I wonder if Tolkien, I actually kind of love that we're going really deep into the text and what Tolkien meant. I think, if I remember this correctly, I'm afraid of the huge Tolkien fans who might send me hate mail for this if I get this wrong, was I think Tolkien saw Frodo as an instrument of divine providence, which is why, even though Frodo, failed, he didn't destroy the ring, why Gollum bit the ring off and then effectively stumbled into the lava. That was almost divine providence pushing Gollum off of the edge. But it's kind of interesting because our perspective, again, making a differentiation here, the Jewish perspective here is different. It's not that you do what you can. Our perspective would have been God could have helped Frodo make the actual decision. Like your example of the Jewish people, they walked into the ocean. They didn't just be oh, sorry, we can't do it. And then the sea split. It was no, you do it. You do it. And then God will help you and he'll do it. It seems like the Lord of the Rings perspective is I'll do it, I'll fail, but then God will just save me and Deus ex machina.
What you're saying is powerful because that could be, as we know, Tolkien was an ardent Christian. And that could exactly be the exact divide right there, which is that Christianity believes human beings cannot get all the way. They always need that intervention, not done through them, but for them. And that would be obviously Jesus dying for our sins, but we can ever fully repent ourselves. Well, we believe no. With God's help, we can go all the way.
Wow, that's awesome. That's great. I almost feel like that should be the concluding thought because that's amazing. I do want to just ask one last point. So the way Tolkien understood Frodo's quest, just because I think there is an interesting element, he said, okay, so Frodo undertook his quest out of love to save the world he knew from disaster at his own expense, if he could, and also in complete humility, acknowledging that he was wholly inadequate to the task. His real contract was only to do what he could, to try to find a way and to go as far on the road as his strength of mind and body allowed. He did that. Now, we apparently disagree. But then the last thing he says, I do not myself see that the breaking of his mind and will under demonic pressure after torment was any more a moral failure than the breaking of his body would have been, say by being strangled by Gollum or crushed by a falling rock. So again, that's kind of interesting. Let's say Frodo got there. In terms of, again, how do we relate to that? Frodo can't be blamed if he got crushed by a falling rock. I would assume that that's clearly not his fault. You don't choose to get crushed by a rock unless he threw himself under it. But I don't think that's what he meant. But so that seems to be how Tolkien understood it. Frodo's inability to throw the ring in was like being killed by Gollum or crushed by a falling rock. Just to make sure we're crystal clear here. It seems like we disagree, but why do we disagree?
It's a hard call. Again, I think demonic is a demonic voice, an urge that's super powerful. Is a demonic takeover where he has no free will whatsoever anymore. He's taken over in a compulsive way that's, again, there's not two voices anymore in his head. It's just one voice. That's the part we don't know. If you want to say what Tolkien means impossible, he means impossible. But that being said, we have some traditions that there's something called going beyond the impossible. It could be that in this case, there's that beyond the impossible, that there's this super gear that is unique in a way to the Jewish people, where we begin where the impossible starts. So impossible for us is not truly impossible.
Rabbi Ganger, thank you so much for joining us. It's a great discussion.
Thank you for having me. Always a pleasure to talk about my two favorite things, Judaism and Lord of the Rings. It's been a while.
Perfect. I think we have a fairly similar passion here. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to the Dilemmas on Screen, a Jewish Perspective podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe. If you have any suggestions for a moral dilemma you'd like analyzed, feel free to send it over. Thanks again, and see you next time.